To err is human, but to forgive is divine. I always thought this was a quote from the Bible, but I was told by a friend the other day it's actually by the poet Alexander Pope. Now, how did he come to this discovery? We make so many errors, and it is definitely a human thing that we do, whereas the divine makes no errors at all, but the divine always forgives everyone. I did a show recently about Gurdjieff, and where he wrote in All and Everything that it's one of the great laws that the divine source, his endlessness, forgives all. And I'm just going to quote that, read that for you. It's from page 198 in my edition. And it says, so this is someone speaking, I think it's Beelzebub actually. It goes without saying, God forgives everything. This has even become a law in the world. But his creations, in this case people, must not abuse this all-gracious and everywhere penetrating goodness of his. They must not only care for, but even maintain all he has created. And I think in this day and age, forgiveness seems to be something that's either said willy-nilly, just to try and get oneself out of a situation. Not many people actually forgive someone with all honesty, and it is difficult. It's a very has to be thought about, has to be felt, why one forgives someone, and even oneself. It's something I have to work on myself all the time, and I realise that during all my working on myself and getting over things that happened in the past and such like, it wasn't just forgiving other people, it was also forgiving myself for the actions that I performed and did. Because we all make errors, we all stumble and fall. And I've made this show for Easter Monday. So Christ has risen. He's been through his 3 days down below in hell and has transformed himself. And as you know, many of the religious institutions, the church, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, blah, 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 they all say that Christ forgives, and he forgives us for everything we do, and that he is a forgiving force. And that's how we can work with the Christ within ourselves, by developing that forgiving force within. And it's something I've been pondering on for years, and Rudolf Steiner has helped me with that development in myself. And so has Sergei O. Prokofiev. He wrote a book called The Occult Significance of Forgiveness, which I highly recommend. It's a book that I reread. I've only had it a few years, but I do reread it quite a lot because there's so much to take in, and I have to keep being reminded why forgiveness is such a powerful energy within us. Now, in one of Marie Steiner's letters, which is, Marie Steiner was the wife of Rudolf Steiner, she writes something which I think is very relevant to this now. She writes, "We can forgive, everyone can forgive, what lies within him to forgive. We can forget what ought to be forgotten instead of rummaging about amongst old injustices. We could draw a line beneath all the old stories that wear us down, and which, either because we are young or are no longer involved, we are not in a position to get to the bottom of." End quote. And I think this is very relevant for us all, even today. We can all forgive, and we do tend to forget a lot of things, and we ought to forget, well, we say we forget what ought to be forgiven instead of, she says, rummaging amongst old injustices. But we can't be caught up and hung up on old injustices. We must learn to forgive those old injustices that we are still letting run through our minds like galloping horses, trying to, well, ruin our development, trying to bring us back down. But we can't just forgive and forget. We have to forgive in a way that we can overcome what happened to us. We need to forgive in a clear way, and we need to do it with a willing conscience. The impulse of forgiveness is something Rudolf Steiner talks about. And the impulse is like our need to want to do this, to will to do this. And we can relate this obviously to the Rudolf Steiner work of, the Gurdjieff work, of wanting, we have a desire, we must will to do it. The nature of forgiveness is something that can be, it's a release, definitely, of old injustices, old energies, old thought patterns. And it should also, if it's forgiveness with another person, help make that relationship better. Though, to help me through life, I used to, when I was not coping with how people are being, or I'm not saying mentally a little bit, and emotionally and physically, of why there's so much stupidity going on out there, or so much lack of common sense, was Christ's words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, which he said, towards the end of his life, when he was he was about to be crucified. And he'd been set up by the Sanhedrin and by the peoples, and because people didn't understand his mission, they were frightened of him, and so they wanted him. Well, the Jews were saying it's because he was pretending to be the king of the Jews, which of course he wasn't. But he was able to forgive them for what they were doing. Forgive them, for they know not what they do, is something I have to use a lot in my life when I see that people are, like I was saying, will do either stupid things, lack of common sense, or try to wind me up, or I see them doing other crazy things. And then when I look back at my past life and the crazy things I've done in my life, I have to work out, like I was saying earlier, of how to forgive myself, why I acted like that. Obviously, it was a different version of myself then. But it's all down to awareness, isn't it? Having a lack of awareness for many people is why people err, make errors, make mistakes. And by doing this spiritual working, we are becoming more aware of what we are doing, what we are saying, what we are feeling. But I wanted to read a little bit from The Occult Significance of Forgiveness by Sergei Prokofiev. And he writes, through an act of forgiveness, we can also become on earth the servants and mediators of Michael, Archangel Michael this is, and Christ, in another quite different direction. And what he's talking about is that through us learning to forgive, we are helping with the Christ work, with also Archangel Michael's work against the dark forces. The dark forces love to stir up everything and make everything tormentuous, make it all just difficult for us. They torment us with their tricks and dark activities and get people to fight amongst each other. And we have to be aware of what it is that these dark forces are trying to do to us. Which again brings in the act of forgiveness. We forgive them for leading us astray. We forgive them for leaving us in temptation. We forgive ourselves for being duped by the dark forces. But waking up and going through this kind of spiritual work, we become aware of when this is happening to us. Our practice should be leading us in a right way, in an awakening way, of the right path. Now I'm going to do a rather long quote from Prokofiev now, because I think he obviously says it much better than I do. He writes, thus, in this historic scene on the hill of Golgotha, where there are people who, in complete unawareness of who is standing before them, are crucifying Christ Jesus, who forgives them from the cross, for he knows that if they had only recognized who was standing before them as the archetype of their own ego, they would never have crucified him, but would have rather have bowed down before him and become his disciples. I'm just going to end the quote here, because we're aiming to become Christ beings ourselves. We're aiming to become enlightened. So that is why Christ is the archetype of what we can attain to be. Anyway, I shall carry on with the quote, continuing. We have at one and the same time a mystical and a historical archetype of the relationship of the lower and the higher ego in every man who has not as yet attained to knowledge of the latter. For being without this knowledge, and having an allegiance only to the lower ego and its egoistic motives, Such a person is, in blindly following it, guilty before his own higher ego rather than before some fellow human being. I just want to end the quote there. Well, we'll continue in a minute, but I just wanted to go over that little bit. You know, it is our lower ego that sends us into error. Our higher ego, which we're attaining to reach and connect with, would keep us on the right path. Continuing. Moreover, one could even say that in giving himself up solely to the forces of his lower ego, he is, in essence, continually crucifying his higher ego in a spiritual sense, even though it nevertheless forgives him, inasmuch as the person himself, in his ordinary consciousness, knows nothing about this state of affairs. On the other hand, when a person forgives, in a more occult sense, the opposite takes place. His higher ego, as it works in the act of forgiveness and permeates the lower ego with its substance, begins to lead it towards spiritual awakening, that is, to a recalling of those purposes and tasks which he put before himself in his higher ego before his birth on earth, but which he completely forgot about once he had incarnated in a physical body. I'm going to end the quote there. I used to be quite anti all this. Oh, we know what we're here for. We're given our life plan before we're born. But now I see we're not given the life plan for our lower ego. We're given our life plan of how we can attain to reach the higher ego. And it's whether we follow that life plan in this life, or whether we get led astray by our lower ego running off and doing all kinds of other things and forgetting what its main purpose had been. So again, this is all about perfecting ourselves and reaching our higher self. Prokofiev writes, "It is of course the case that in pre-earthly existence a man sets himself the most diverse goals and tasks with respect to his impending incarnation. Which of these does he recall in the first instance in the process of forgiveness? He initially recalls those which then came to manifestation in the act of forgiveness itself. Thus he recalls the need in earthly life for a continual self-overcoming, an overcoming of his lower ego, and also for a sacrificial outpouring of self into the world in love." End quote. And this is one of the things that I've been talking a lot over the years with my shows of we need to find that unconditional love within us so that we can develop ourselves, and it's all through unconditional love. And I'm going to just continue with a bit more Prokofiev, continuing that paragraph. However, in the supersensible existence in which man dwells before his birth on earth, in contrast to his earthly state of being, both these goals which have been set before him out of the higher ego exist not in the form of abstract ideals or moral precepts or imperatives, but in the form of actual beings of the spiritual world who embody the respective impulses in their whole essence. End quote. We can get help from above, we can get help from the angels, we can get help from the other beings in the spiritual worlds. Prokofiev writes on the next page, "Before his birth in the earthly world, man first encounters Michael, or Michael as they say in the Steiner work, that high hierarchic spirit, who is always and everywhere defying the dragon. As a result of this meeting there is revealed to man that power which he will need if on earth he is to gain in his own soul the victory of the higher ego over the lower, provided that it is his wish to remain true to this archetype. This is the power of self-overcoming, which leads to the constant victory of the higher over the lower, and to its representative in our cosmos, Michael." That's Archangel Michael. As the spiritual champion of freedom, he represents in the spiritual world that power which may perhaps best be expressed in words of human language in the following lines by Goethe from his unfinished poem Secrets. "In this inner storm and outer struggle, the spirit hears what scarce it comprehends. The man who overcomes himself finds freedom from the power that binds all living creatures." I'm just going to end the quote there. So he's talking about the call to Michael, and if we can get to Archangel Michael, we can then continue to develop ourselves towards Christ. We behold Michael, we behold Christ, and it's these higher powers that our soul is reaching to. I'm just going to read this little bit from Prokofiev. This is that power, whose bearer in our cosmos is the Christ, the power of world sacrificial love. Thus Rudolf Steiner, drawing from the central stream of Christian esotericism, also calls him the great sacrifice, the sacrificial mystic lamb. End quote. And as we know, Christ did sacrifice himself for us. He takes on all our sins and deeds, and this is to help the earth develop. Otherwise, all these sins that we have done over our lives, and everybody's doing this, is going into the earth and not helping the earth develop. It's developing in a dark way because it's got everyone's sins. But Christ came forward, and this is according to Rudolf Steiner, and bears all those sins so that the earth can help develop. Isn't that just such a beautiful thing, that the Christ did that so that the earth can develop? It's not just about us, it's about the planet. I'm now going to read a few pages of Prokofiev's book, because this blew my mind and made me see everything about forgiveness in a totally different light. He's entitled this, it's not a chapter, it's a subchapter, called Forgiveness and the Karmic Activity of Christ. Through an act of forgiveness, we can also become on earth the servants and mediators of Michael and Christ in another quite different direction, in order that we may better understand this, letting us imagine what takes place from an occult point of view in the opposite case, in the event of non-forgiveness. If an injury is inflicted or a wrong perpetrated on a certain person by another human being, the all-embracing laws of karma enter into operation at once. Their task is to call forth, sometimes in this life, but more often in a subsequent life, a situation whereby both human beings meet again, though this time in such a way that the latter person, who stands guilty before the first, will now have to make amends for his action in some way or other. That is, to bring the first person just as much good in the new situation as he brought him evil in the former life. If one takes into account the many-faceted and extraordinarily complex interweaving of individual human destinies on earth, both as they concern the guilt of one person towards another, an aspect which demands, as of necessity, karmic compensation, and also all the infinite karmic connections which unite the individual human being with his people, and with mankind as a whole, with his epoch, it is not difficult to imagine what a truly colossal task, one that embraces our entire cosmos, the forces of karma have to undertake in order that every human deed, feeling or thought may, sooner or later, with iron necessity, receive its due recompense. Thus, for the fulfillment of this all-embracing law of the iron necessity of karma, which is at the same time also the law of the higher justice of our cosmos, all 9 divine spiritual hierarchies in the spiritual worlds must participate. Rudolf Steiner speaks about this as follows, so we're quoting Rudolf Steiner now. This human karma is, at first, like a vow, a curtain. If we look behind this vow, we gaze at the weaving deeds and influences of archai, archangeli, angeli, kyriates, dynamas, exousiae, seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. End quote, and that's from Steiner's lecture of the 8th of June 1924, Karmic Relationships, Volume 8. So continuing with Prokofiev. For all these hierarchies, however, it is by no means a matter of indifference whether a man forgives the person who stands guilty before him, or has perpetrated some evil against him. If he does not forgive, he thereby, so to speak, forces the hierarchies in future to form world karma and the whole future evolution of the world and humanity that depends on it, in complete correspondence with the law of iron necessity, which calls forth sooner or later the just and sufficient compensation for every evil deed. The infinite spiritual powers of all 9 hierarchies must, in this event, be expended upon the fashioning of situations which enable this compensation to achieve fulfillment in earthly evolution. Hence it is possible to say that every refusal to forgive brings about the further strengthening of the net of the iron necessity of karma which envelops our cosmos. On the other hand, if a man forgives in the way that has been characterized in this book, he is thereby voluntarily renouncing that recompense to which he has an objective right in the cosmos for having suffered an unrequited wrong through another person's doing, and by renouncing the recompense that would surely have been bound to come his way in one of his subsequent earthly lives, such a man liberates by this step truly boundless forces of the higher hierarchies from the necessity of creating in the future on the earth more new situations for the compensating of past karma. Thus, in the event of forgiveness, these forces of the higher hierarchies are made free, which is to say that they can be used not in the sense of the laws of iron karmic necessity, but as higher spiritual forces which, through being freely sacrificed to the world, work on within it in a completely new form, one which from the standpoint of earthly evolution can be called grace. In other words, the essential part of the spiritual forces which were formerly used by the hierarchies for the fulfillment of the all-embracing law of karma is liberated from this task and may now be used in another way, namely, in the spirit of the intentions and purposes of Christ, as the building stones for the new moral cosmos which he is gradually constructing, and of which Rudolf Steiner speaks at the very end of his book Occult Science. Because of this, there gradually begins to arise in the very heart of that realm of iron karmic necessity which permeates our entire cosmos, a new kingdom, a kingdom where karma becomes grace, where necessity is transformed into total spiritual freedom, and where Christ himself works as the Lord of Karma. For as a result of every act of true forgiveness, man, as it were, fashions in the web of karma a space which is not filled with karmic substance, and into which Christ can then enter and work within it, moreover, to which the luciferic and Ahrimanic powers have no access. Thus, with every act of forgiveness, man transforms a part of the world field of karma, which envelops our cosmos with a dense net of iron necessity, into a new field of activity of Christ as the Lord of Karma. As it is in our time that Christ becomes the Lord of Karma, it follows that forgiveness will both in our time and to an ever greater extent in the future have an immeasurable significance for human evolution. And I'm going to end the quote there. Isn't that just amazing? Isn't that just a beautiful thing? It kind of tells us what our mission as a human being is, to help Christ in developing this world by making it a beautiful world full of good deeds, good intentions, good impulses. And by working with an occult forgiveness, the true significance of what forgiveness should be, we then help Christ and all the other beings, the angels, archangels, seraphims, and the etc., to help with the transformation of this earth and ourselves and future karma lives for everyone. And this is why Christ is the Lord of Karma. I hope this has been helpful to you. I highly recommend Sergei O. Prokofiev's book, The Occult Significance of Forgiveness. And I wish you all well in your spiritual path and continuing to your development, your soul development. May God bless you one and all. May the Christ walk with you. May the Archangel Michael walk with you. And may you walk with Christ. Thank you for listening.